Welcome to our program, Colonel Sweet.
Hey, Daniel, thanks for bringing me back on. I appreciate the opportunity to talk about Ukraine.
I would like to start with new discussions on the West about the possibility of a ceasefire in Ukraine. Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk said that the negotiations between Ukraine and Russia could begin as early as this winter. What is your take on that, and how can you assess the willingness of the Russia to accept any kind of a normal deal with Ukraine, and what is your reaction to this?
Yeah, we had this conversation last month and probably 6 months ago too. Look, I don't see a ceasefire from my perspective. I don't see a ceasefire being a logical conclusion to this war. Ukraine clearly wants to retain its sovereign territory that existed in 1991. That includes the Donbass region and Crimea. Putin is not in any position right now that he's going to relinquish control over those areas that he illegally annexed. So that's the starting point, is coming to an agreement on where the territorial divide will be. Now, we also don't see Putin making any concessions despite what's going on in Syria with the loss of that country and the port and airfields, which are also a gateway to Russian activity throughout the Middle East and Africa. He is doubling down on his efforts in Ukraine at the expense of those operations. So no, I don't see a ceasefire in the near term, not unless Putin is brought to the negotiation table by a significant turn on the ground.
We will also cover the situation in Syria, but let me ask you about the recent statement of the French President Emmanuel Macron. There have been some publications that suggest that Macron is trying to organize a coalition of European countries who will be ready to deploy troops to Ukraine to enforce a ceasefire. There was a publication about 40,000 European troops which could be deployed to Ukraine in case of a ceasefire. What is your reaction to this, and how can it influence the outcome of this war?
Look, the president of France has said this before. He is probably about 12 months ago, I believe, he actually came out and said that he was for putting French troops into Ukraine, not necessarily along the combatant zone area, but in the rear of Ukraine to train soldiers. So it's not the first time he's thought of this. But it still comes down to an agreed upon line on the ground that both countries, Russia and Ukraine, agree is the border. And right now, that's the issue. That is what the problem is. And we keep talking about what the border is going to be in Ukraine, but we forget that, Ukraine occupies most of the Kursk region in Russia. So how's that going to be adjusted? Look, you can put as many troops as you want on the left side of the border. You'll still have Russia on the right side of the border that will continue to build combat power and strength. And they have demonstrated in the past 30 plus years that they don't honor ceasefires, peace negotiations or treaties. They simply take that time to refit and reorganize and come at you again. So until you can get Russia to get to the point where they accept that they did not overthrow the Ukrainian government, that they are not going to occupy all of Ukraine. And I think that's the hard part, because deep in the back of their minds, that is their end state. They have said it repeatedly. So to live in this, I don't know, fantasy land that somehow Putin's going to come to the negotiation table and cede some terrain in exchange for peace, I just don't see it happening. And I don't understand why leaders in the West don't understand that and won't come to that reality.
We have also heard new statements from US President-elect Donald Trump and his newly appointed national security team. There was a meeting between Donald Trump, President Zelensky, and French President Emmanuel Macron regarding the recent statement from Trump's team. Do you see any kind of signs of Trump's future policy on Ukraine, and what does this recent statement from Kit Kellogg say about their policy? From your perspective, how can you assess their recent statements on Ukraine?
Unfortunately, there's multiple messages that are coming out of the United States. One comes from the President-elect Trump, another that resonated before the election came from the vice president-elect Vance. And now you have Lieutenant General Kellogg, retired U.S. Army general, who also is putting out information today. But remember, Kellogg put a plan out about 6 months ago that the Trump administration oriented themselves to also. I think that the plans and the wordings and the positioning, right now it's positioning, it's who is going to get the best end of the deal. I think 2 weeks ago, we saw Russia publish a map that showed how Ukraine was going to be divided into 3 different sectors and how they're going to manage that part of the world. And again, they came heavy. I think the Putin administration, that's what they want. They work off of propaganda. They work off of fear of the unknown. I think the Kellogg plan that we're looking at right now still involves, at some degree, stopping the war itself to some degree, but that requires Russia to stop, and that requires Ukraine to stop. And there are measures, I think, within the plan, at least the Kellogg plan for 6 months ago, about how the Trump administration would act if either Putin or Zelensky did not adhere to the agreements. But let's understand, the United States and NATO are not the combatant forces. The combatant forces are Ukraine and Russia. And right now, they cannot come to an agreement on what they believe the lines in the sand are. And not only is it lines in the sand, but it's what happens afterwards. Do you keep a Putin, a war criminal, with everything he does? I mean, do you allow him to just continue as the leader of Russia? Can you allow him to continue to lead Russia? There is no normalization. There is no reset. And from my position, the only way this comes to an end is if Russian forces are completely out of Ukraine. And then if you want to talk about DMZ, demilitarization zone, and where Russian forces are, where NATO forces are, and whether or not Ukraine enters NATO, you can have that conversation. But until Russian forces are completely out, I don't see where an agreement comes to be. No matter what well-intended plans are put out there, you just have 2 adversaries that aren't going to agree to what the West presents.
What would it take from Donald Trump's team to force Vladimir Putin to a negotiations table, from your perspective, if there is such a decision to force Putin to make concessions to Ukraine and to agree for a ceasefire, but, for example, on appropriate for Ukraine terms?
Yeah, look, I think what has to be done is Putin has to recognize a threat against him, but more importantly, a threat against his armed forces. Okay, that in Russia, but that in Ukraine, he has to recognize through military means, in my opinion, their vulnerability. Is going to have to sustain significant casualties. I think Zelensky yesterday, as a matter of fact, said there are over 800,000 Russians that were still in Ukraine. And whether or not that's true isn't the issue. What the issue is that there's 1,500 of those Russians that are being killed or wounded every day. So it's logical to come to the conclusion that there are a sizable number of Russian forces and North Korean forces and Chechen forces that are in Ukraine and along the borders. The only way to defeat that force is to strike them beyond the border. And right now, to me, that's where the rub is. The Biden administration doesn't want U.S. or Western weapon systems to be striking those targets beyond the borders of Ukraine. And the only way to stop those forces from coming into Ukraine is to do just that. And when you inflict a significant amount of casualties on those forces in areas that have been given to them as sanctuary, okay, and then you create that maneuver space between where those forces are and where the Ukrainian forces are now, then you provide space for the Ukrainian military, probably in the spring or the summer, to have a counteroffensive that's capable of pushing Russian forces out of the country. But that's an investment. That's an investment in time. That's an investment in military hardware, and that's an investment in lives. So those are hard decisions. But I think the right man, the envoy now to the war, General Kellogg, a career military officer who's commanded the 82nd Airborne Division of Special Operations Forces in Europe, I think he has a firm grasp and understanding of what the ground looks like, and having worked and trained and planned for events against Russia throughout his military career, I think we're going to see some headway. But what we have to see also is the Trump administration that's willing to listen to his advice.
Donald Trump said that Russia had already lost the war against Ukraine because it had suffered more than 700,000 casualties. From your perspective, do you see this as a kind of a message from Trump to Vladimir Putin?
It may be a message, but at some point it's irrelevant, because Putin doesn't acknowledge 700,000 casualties as being a setback or a loss. What he acknowledges is that he's making ground, okay, in Ukraine right now. Okay, and there was a chart the other day that showed territory that Russia's been able to reacquire over the past 30 to 60 days, both in the Kursk region, but also in the Donbass region. So he being Putin sees Russian lives, the ratio of Russian lives to land that he's reacquiring. He sees it as a positive thing, and he's willing to invest more. He's willing to hire more North Korean forces to come in and do his bidding. He's willing to go into, the Russian territories and pull more people out and bring them to fight the fight. And they're not getting training. They're getting, 7 to 10 days of in processing into the military, and they're finding themselves in the front lines. That's feeding the meat grinder. And it's been said before, the meat assaults, meat grinder, but that's what it is. He's simply throwing bodies at the problem. And he has abandoned other areas in order to obtain Ukraine. And we have to recognize that he is doubling down. He's putting all of his eggs into one basket, saying it's Ukraine or bust. And I don't know how you come to a ceasefire with that type of mentality.
I would like also to cover with you latest statement from Jake Sullivan, President Biden's national security advisor. It seems like there is a big blame game right now, because Sullivan says that there are problems on the ground in Ukraine because Ukraine struggles to conscript enough soldiers. Also, according to the Associated Press, Biden administration urged Ukraine to lower the age for mobilization to conscript Ukrainians from 18 years old. What is your reaction to this, and do you see this as another blame game before the end of the work of Biden's administration?
Yeah, we wrote about this. Mark Toth and I wrote about this in The Hill. To me, it's more of an excuse from Jake Sullivan's position. His excuse is, if you put more people in the fight, you'd be winning right now. And that's not necessarily true. Just look at the Russian example. They're putting more people in the fight, and they're not necessarily winning. They're gaining some terrain, but at what cost? I mean, 1,500 a day. Just 2 weeks ago, they lost over 2,000 in one day. So more isn't better. And we write about this from a perspective of the casualties that were generated during the First World War. I mean, the loss of life, just throwing bodies against machine guns. Machine guns win. Okay, it's the weapon systems that the United States hasn't provided in a timely manner to change the outset of the war. Look at what Ukraine's done with what they have. I mean, look, 750,000 casualties, not KIA, but casualties, killed, wounded, missing in action, taken prisoner. They were able to do that with what was given to them to fight a defensive type of battle. Now, imagine what they would have done if they had more offensive capability. Okay, yes, it does take numbers to man tanks. It does take numbers to man artillery systems. But just simply having more Ukrainian men and women in trenches, firing at Russians as they assault them from their defensive positions, that doesn't win wars. Offense wins wars. Offensive weapons wins wars. And in my opinion, the Biden administration has failed to provide Ukraine the offensive weapon systems they need in order to accomplish that objective. They've been very good at allowing Ukraine to survive and to continue to defend. But because of that, it's prolonged the war now for 34 months, and it easily will go into 36 months. But defense hasn't won anything for Ukraine right now. It's bought time, And time's a good thing, but they need more if they're going to win. Okay, and right now, the West is stuck on, do we support win or do we support a ceasefire? And they are leaning hard towards a ceasefire, which in the end is a short-term solution to a long-term problem. And the problem won't go away as long as Putin's in charge of the regime.
Let's cover also situation in Syria. Bashar al-Assad's regime has collapsed. Rebels have captured the major cities of Syria, Aleppo and the capital, Damascus. Russian forces, meanwhile, have withdrawn its troops, military personnel and fleet from the Syrian bases. How do you see the implications of this development? Firstly, for the balance of power on the Middle East, and second question, how do you see its implications on the war in Ukraine, on Russia's war effort against Ukraine?
Yeah, look, Mark and I wrote about this also. We've written a lot lately for The Hill. But what we see right now is the loss of Syria impacts both Russia and Iran to the point of Russia loses, if you will, port facilities and airfields that are the hub center, if you will, for sustainment and force projection of Russian activities in the Middle East, but also North Africa, the Sudan, and West Africa. Without those bases, without those facilities, they can no longer project force, influence. So that's a problem for Russia. For Russia to withdraw from there, it signifies that they're not going to be able to, unless they find other ports, and they may. They were looking at developing a port in Sudan. They were also looking at developing another port in Libya. But in the meantime, they've lost access to those regions, and they've had to pull out, or at least go to ground. For Iran, it's equally as complicated because Syria provided them sanctuary from which they could import weapons, sanctuary in which the IRGC could train and equip Hezbollah, Hamas, and other Islamic extremist organizations that were proxies to Iran. They've lost that area and they've had to withdraw. So they no longer have the capability, at least from a Syrian perspective, they no longer have that capability to project force into Israel. Okay, other than their own ballistic missiles and drones, and they are in a sense vulnerable to Israeli airstrikes. I mean, Israel on the last set of airstrikes in October knocked out most of their air defense systems, the S-400s and 300s. So they're vulnerable right now, and they're in need of a number of things. But one is a proxy that can continue the war for them, because they cannot project force into Israel other than their own ballistic missiles. And as we've seen twice in April and October, they failed to be able to impact Israel through their own means. So the downfall of Syria is significant for both of them. And it could be, depending upon how the Syrian rebels can consolidate and organize a government within Syria. And there's a lot of external influence from both Turkey. Obviously, there's other influences to other countries as far as is it going to be secular type of Islam? Are we going to see more anti-Jewish perspectives, anti-Israeli state perspective once they get settled? So there's a lot still to be seen. But right now, the balance, at least for Russia in Iran, is significant. They've lost a lot.
And another question: has Russia failed to help Assad to stay in power because of war against Ukraine, or just because Russians were not interested in committing other resources helping Assad to stay in power?
I think it's mostly because of the war in Ukraine has depleted their ability to rapidly reinforce forces that were in Syria. Their ability to project naval power. Remember, they no longer have a naval force in the Crimea area. That they've been forced to withdraw, and they've lost a number of assets. And there is a naval base, obviously, that they're working on in Georgia. But nonetheless, for them to be able to project power, to project or to sustain their forces, they have to have those airfields. They have to have that naval facility. And once both of those bases came under threat, they lost the ability to put assets or supplies into those areas and reinforce them. And quite frankly, they were caught by surprise. And I think it caught everybody by surprise, the speed at which this occurred. But the speed occurred because, my opinion, because of what Israel has done over the past 12 months to weaken the IRGC presence in Syria, to weaken some of the other forces in those areas, and has prevented Syria from doing other types of actions because they've been worried about what was going on in the south versus turning their attention to the rebels. And once the Russian, daddy, if you will, Putin, big brother, lost his ability to support Syria, we saw in effect how effective Syria can be. And the answer is they're not, unless they have big brother behind them striking civilian targets with Russian aircraft.
And last question for you. Israel has conducted airstrikes on the Syrian advanced weaponry, strategic weapons, chemical weapons, and the Syrian Navy fleet. Also, there is an incursion in place by the Israeli army on the Golan Heights in Syria. Does this mean that Israeli armed forces are exploiting current opportunities which have been created by the collapse of the Bashar al-Assad's regime?
So the short answer is yes. They're taking advantage of a weakness. They're taking advantage of the lack of combat power in areas which they deem to be areas of national interest to them. The Golan Heights is significant in that it overlooks northern Israel. It is a significant piece of terrain that they did not want to afford Syrian rebels to be able to occupy and possibly use against them at a latter date. The same thing goes with the destruction of the Syrian Air Force, the Syrian Navy, and in some cases weapon systems owned by Syria, but also, at risk of being captured and then used against them being Israel at a latter date. And I think the biggest threat for them, or the biggest concern within Syria, was some stockpiles of chemical munitions. So I think it was in national security interest for Israel to secure the Golan Heights, but also to take out all those assets, because quite frankly, they don't know the intent. They don't know the end state, of where this revolution, where this overthrow, where this governance is going to conclude. So they are taking their best guess, and they are setting conditions for their survival. So it's a difficult time for everyone in the Middle East. But if you look at it from an Israeli perspective, they've been at this, since 1945, defending themselves, and they are taking care of themselves right now.
Thank you, Colonel Sweet, for your time and for your support for Ukraine. Glory to Ukraine.
Hey, thank you, Daniel. I appreciate the opportunity to come back on your show.